believed the Countess died in the fire until the new governess sang the lullaby only. She knew the rain arrived the same hour Eleanor Ashford did, cold, relentless, turning the gravel drive of Blackwood Estate into a slick ribbon of grey. She stepped from the hired car with her single leather case, her dark coat already heavy with moisture, and looked up at the manor house. 3 stories of New England stone, windows like closed eyes, ivy climbing the eastern wall where fire damage still scarred the brick. October 1962, and the Berkshire Mountains were already preparing for an early winter. Eleanor had been told very little. The position, governess to a 7-year-old girl named Violet. The employer, Mr. Nicholas Hartley, widower, reclusive since the tragedy. The tragedy itself was mentioned only in whispers by the employment agency. A fire 18 months ago that had consumed the East Wing and taken the life of the Countess Marguerite Hartley, Nicholas's wife, a woman of extraordinary beauty and continental breeding who had never quite fit into the rigid social fabric of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. But if you've made it this far, I'd love to ask a favor. Please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Your support means everything, and it helps me continue bringing you stories like this one. Now let's continue with Eleanor's arrival at Blackwood. Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper, met her at the door. A woman built like a ship's figurehead, all hard angles and suspicion. "You're the 4th governess this year," she said, not unkindly but as a statement of fact. "The child is difficult, refuses to speak, hasn't said a word since the fire." Eleanor followed her through halls that smelled of beeswax and old grief. Family portraits lined the walls, stern-faced Hartleys dating back to the Revolution, but no recent photographs. The furniture was expensive but worn, the kind of wealth that had been established long ago and was now quietly crumbling at the edges. They passed the sealed East Wing, where the smell of smoke still lingered faintly, mixing with the colder scent of abandonment. "Mr. Hartley is in Boston on business, Mrs. Dawson continued. "He'll return Friday evening. Until then, you'll dine with Violet in the nursery. Breakfast at 7, lessons at 8. She knows her letters, but won't write them. Knows her numbers, but won't count aloud. Dr. Morrison says it's shock, that she'll speak when she's ready, but—" The housekeeper's voice trailed off, her expression suggesting she believed no such thing. Violet was waiting in the 3rd-floor nursery, a small figure in a blue dress standing at the window that overlooked the garden. She didn't turn when Eleanor entered. She was pale, almost ethereally so, with her mother's dark curls and her father's serious grey eyes. A beautiful child, but there was something ancient in her stillness, as if she'd already learned lessons meant for much older souls. "Hello, Violet," Eleanor said softly, setting down her case. "My name is Eleanor. I'm here to be your teacher and your friend, if you'll let me." The girl's eyes slid toward her, assessed, then returned to the window. Eleanor recognized the look. It was the same guarded evaluation she'd perfected herself years ago, back when she'd been a different person living a different life, back when she'd been Marguerite. The deception had been necessary. After the fire, after she'd escaped through the servants' passage while the flames consumed her bedroom, after she'd watched from the woods as her husband stood in the courtyard, refusing to let the fire brigade search for her body because he knew. He must have known she'd chosen to disappear. She'd had 2 choices. Die as Marguerite Beaumont Hartley, the French Countess who'd never belonged here, who'd been slowly suffocating under the weight of Nicholas's controlling love and this town's judgment. Or live as someone new. She'd chosen survival. She'd chosen the clean slate of Eleanor Ashford, governess with impeccable references, forged in New York by the one friend who'd understood why she had to run, hired by the very man she'd fled. It was insane. It was dangerous. But she'd had 18 months to watch from a distance as Nicholas descended into grief-stricken isolation, as he rejected every governess who tried to help Violet, as the child stopped speaking and the estate fell into disrepair. And she'd realized something crucial. Her daughter needed her. Whatever failures had driven her to fake her own death, whatever suffocation she'd felt in this marriage, Violet was innocent. Violet was suffering. So Eleanor had applied for the position, had travelled from Chicago with her new identity, and now stood in the nursery she'd once decorated herself, facing the daughter who didn't recognize her own mother. The first 3 days passed in careful observation. Eleanor established routines, morning walks in the garden despite the cold, afternoon drawing lessons, evening story time by the fire. Violet participated mechanically, never speaking, never smiling, her small hand limp in Eleanor's when they walked. At meals, she ate exactly half of what was served, no more. At night, Eleanor could hear her crying through the walls, soft, devastated sounds that tore at something essential in her chest. Mrs. Dawson warmed slightly as the week progressed. "You have a patience the others didn't," she admitted Thursday evening, serving Eleanor tea in the small parlour off the kitchen that had become her retreat. "Miss Violet seems less agitated with you." "She's carrying a terrible weight," Eleanor said, wrapping her hands around the teacup. "Losing her mother so suddenly, so violently, and with Mr. Hartley gone so often." "He can't bear to be here," Mrs. Dawson interrupted, her voice dropping. "Can't look at the child without seeing the Countess. They say—" She hesitated, then continued in a rush, as if confessing. "They say he blames himself. That he and the Countess had quarrelled that night, that he'd been in his study drinking while the fire started. By the time he noticed the smoke, it was too late. The east wing went up like kindling, something about how they'd stored paint thinners in the old servants' quarters. He tried to get to her, nearly died himself, but the flames—" She shook her head. "They never found her body. The fire burned too hot, they said, just ashes." Eleanor kept her face carefully neutral, though her hands trembled slightly around the cup. She hadn't known about the quarrel. She'd already been halfway to the servants' passage when Nicholas started shouting, his voice thick with whiskey and rage. She hadn't known he'd tried to save her. The newspapers she'd read in New York had painted him as coldly standing by, and she'd believed it because it fit the narrative she needed to justify leaving. "Was it a happy marriage?" Eleanor asked quietly. Mrs. Dawson's expression closed off. "That's not my place to say, miss. But I will tell you this. The Countess was not suited to this life. She was French, you understand, from some minor nobility family that had lost everything in the war. She met Mr. Hartley in Paris in '53 when he was on business. She was 19, beautiful as a painting, and he was absolutely mad for her. Brought her back here, married her within 3 months. But she never fit. The ladies in town thought her too proud, too foreign. She had ideas about art, about music, about raising Violet in some bohemian fashion. And Mr. Hartley." She paused. He loved her desperately, but he wanted to keep her, control her, shape her into what a Hartley wife should be. It was the most honest assessment Eleanor had heard, and it validated every feeling that had driven her away. But it also complicated things. Nicholas had been suffocating, yes, but he'd also been terrified of losing her. And she left anyway, in the cruelest way possible. Friday evening arrived with a bitter wind and the sound of tires on gravel. Nicholas Hartley had returned. Eleanor heard him enter through the front hall, heard Mrs. Dawson's murmured greeting, heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs as he went directly to the nursery. She waited in her small bedroom down the hall, heart hammering, as father and daughter had their silent reunion. When Nicholas finally emerged 20 minutes later, he knocked softly on her door. Eleanor opened it to find him standing in the dimly lit hallway, still in his travelling coat, looking exhausted and older than his 36 years. He'd been handsome once, in a stern, aristocratic way. Dark hair, strong jaw, those serious grey eyes. But grief had carved new lines around his mouth and shadows beneath his eyes. "Miss Ashford," he he said, his voice low and measured. "I'm Nicholas Hartley. I apologize for not being here to greet you properly when you arrived. Mr. Hartley." Eleanor kept her voice pitched slightly higher than her natural register, her accent flattened of all French influence. "I understand. Mrs. Dawson explained you had business in Boston. May we speak?" He gestured toward the stairs. "I'd like to hear your assessment of Violet." They descended to his study, a masculine room lined with law books and smelling of leather and pipe tobacco. He poured himself a whiskey, the same crystal decanter, Eleanor noted, that had always sat on that corner of the desk, and offered her sherry, which she declined. As he settled into the chair behind his desk, she studied him covertly. He looked haunted. Whatever she'd believed about his coldness, his control, there was genuine devastation in the slump of his shoulders. "She still doesn't speak," he said. It wasn't a question. "No, but she's engaged more this week than Mrs. Dawson says she has in months. She draws, she walks, she's present in a way that suggests she's listening, processing. The doctors say it's trauma, that watching her mother die." His voice broke and he stopped, took a drink. "I should have been there. I should have saved her. Instead, I was drunk and angry and—" He caught himself, seemed to remember he was speaking to a stranger. "Forgive me, this isn't appropriate. Grief makes everything appropriate, Mr. Hartley." Eleanor chose her words carefully. "Violet needs time. She needs safety and patience, and she needs her mother." The words came out raw and bitter. "But her mother is dead because I was too goddamn stubborn to let her breathe." The confession hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt something crack in her chest, the careful wall she'd built between Eleanor and Marguerite. This broken man wasn't the controlling husband she'd remembered, or perhaps he was both, the man who'd suffocated her and the man who now suffocated under guilt. "Tell me about her," Eleanor said quietly. "About the Countess." Nicholas looked up sharply, as if surprised by the request. Then slowly he began to speak. He told her about meeting Marguerite in Paris, about how she'd been working in a bookshop near the Sorbonne, how she'd argued with him about Flaubert and made him laugh for the first time since his father's death. He told her about bringing her to Stockbridge, about how the town had resented her European sophistication, her artistic friends, her unconventional ideas about education and women's independence. He told her about the fights, about how he'd tried to mold her into something acceptable, about how she'd grown quieter and sadder until that last night when she'd finally told him she was suffocating, that she couldn't be what he wanted. "I told her she was being dramatic," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told her she just needed to try harder to fit in, and then I left her alone in that room, and an hour later the house was burning, and she was gone." Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes. She'd left believing he didn't understand, that he couldn't see what he was doing to her. But he'd understood. He simply hadn't known how to stop. And now he was drowning in the knowledge that his inability to let go had killed the woman he loved. "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that she would want you to save your daughter now. To give Violet what she couldn't have, space to be herself, permission to grieve in her own way, freedom to grow into whoever she's meant to become." Nicholas studied her with those penetrating grey eyes. "You're very young to be so wise, Miss Ashford. How old are you?" 26, Eleanor lied, shaving 3 years off Marguerite's actual age. "And you've known loss." "Everyone has known loss, Mr. Hartley. The question is whether we learn from it." Something shifted in his expression, a spark of recognition she hadn't intended to kindle, but he simply nodded, finished his drink, and stood. "Thank you for your candor. And for your work with Violet. The agency said your references were impeccable, but I admit I was skeptical after the last 3 governesses fled within weeks. You're different somehow. More—" He trailed off, searching for the word. "Invested," Eleanor supplied. "Yes, invested." He walked her to the door of the study. If there's anything you need, anything that might help Violet, please don't hesitate to ask." As Eleanor climbed the stairs back to her room, she felt the dangerous pull of old love mixed with new understanding. She'd come back to save her daughter, but she hadn't anticipated this, Nicholas's transformation from controlling husband to guilt-ravaged widower, his genuine desire to change. It complicated everything. Because if he'd been irredeemable, she could maintain her distance, complete her mission, and disappear again. But this version of Nicholas, broken open by loss, finally willing to see his own failures, this version was harder to resist. In the nursery, Violet was still awake, sitting up in bed and staring at the door as if she'd been waiting. Eleanor sat beside her, smoothed back her dark curls, and on impulse began to hum. It was a French lullaby, one she'd sung every night when Violet was a baby, before the marriage had soured and Nicholas had objected to too much French influence. The melody filled the quiet room. "Fais dodo, colas mon petit frère." Violet's eyes went wide. Her small hand reached out and clutched Eleanor's arm with surprising strength. Her mouth opened, and for the first time in 18 months, she spoke. Just one word, barely a whisper, but it shattered everything. "Maman." The house held its breath in the seconds that followed. Eleanor felt her careful disguise fracturing, felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. She could deny it, could claim coincidence, could retreat back behind Eleanor Ashford's borrowed identity, or she could face what she'd done, the pain she'd caused by choosing escape over confrontation, the damage her absence had inflicted on this innocent child. Downstairs, she heard Nicholas's study door open, heard his footsteps in the hall. He'd heard Violet speak. He was coming. Eleanor looked into her daughter's eyes, eyes that held recognition and confusion and desperate hope, and made her choice. She pulled Violet into her arms, held her tight, and whispered in French against her hair, "Je suis là, ma petite. Maman est là." Meant when Nicholas burst into the nursery 30 seconds later, what he found was this: his silent daughter sobbing in the arms of the new governess, both of them rocking together while Eleanor sang that familiar French lullaby, and Violet clutching her with the fierce grip of a child who'd found something precious she'd thought was lost forever. "What's happening?" Nicholas's voice was sharp with alarm. "What did you do?" Eleanor looked up at him over Violet's dark head, and in that moment he saw it, the exact angle of her chin, the particular shade of her eyes, the way she held his daughter. She watched recognition dawn in his face like a slow sunrise, watched disbelief give way to shock, give way to something more complex that might have been joy or rage or relief, or all three at once. "Marguerite," he breathed, "we need to talk." "Eleanor," Marguerite said quietly, "but not here, not now. First, Violet needs—" "You're alive." He took a step forward, then stopped, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. "You've been alive this whole time. You let me think. Let everyone think." His voice broke. "I mourned you. I blamed myself. I wanted to die because I'd killed you, and you were alive." The fury in his voice was building, but beneath it she heard the raw wound of betrayal. Violet began to cry harder, confused and frightened by her father's anger. Marguerite held her tighter, met Nicholas's eyes with all the complicated truth she could muster. "I was dying here," she said simply. "Maybe not physically, but in every way that mattered. I couldn't breathe, Nicholas. I couldn't be myself. And that night when the fire started, I saw a chance to escape and I took it. I know that was cowardly. I know that was cruel. But I chose survival." "And now?" His hands were trembling. "Why come back now? Why torture us with this?" Marguerite looked down at Violet, who had finally quieted to shuddering breaths against her shoulder. "Because she needed me. Because 18 months of watching from a distance while she suffered was enough. Because I realized that running away from you didn't mean I could run away from being her mother. Nicholas sank into the small chair by Violet's bookshelf, his head in his hands. This is impossible. You're dead. We had a memorial service. The whole town believed what they wanted to believe, Marguerite interrupted, that the proud French Countess who never fit in finally got what she deserved, that you were the tragic widower. It was a neat story. It was my life. He looked up, and his eyes were full of tears. Do you understand what you did to me, to her? Yes, Marguerite said, and for the first time since returning to Blackwood, she let herself feel the full weight of that truth. Yes, I understand. And I'm sorry, I'm so desperately sorry, Nicholas, but I need you to understand too, what you did to me, how you made me feel, how I couldn't see any other way out. They stared at each other across the nursery, across 18 months of grief and guilt and transformation, across the wreckage of a marriage that had been built on passion but corroded by control. Violet had fallen asleep against Marguerite's chest, exhausted by emotion. The rain had started again, tapping against the windows like questions that had no easy answers. What happens now? Nicholas finally asked. I don't know, Marguerite admitted. I came back as Eleanor Ashford because I couldn't come back as myself. Because legally, morally, I'm guilty of abandoning my child, of insurance fraud. The insurance. Nicholas's voice was flat. Christ, Marguerite, I collected $200,000 on your death. I know. I read about it. She'd actually been relieved when she'd seen the notice. It meant Nicholas would be secure, that Violet would be provided for. But now, facing him, she realized how it must look. I didn't do this for money. I didn't plan for there to be a payout. But there was, and now you're back, and if anyone finds out... He stopped, calculating. We'd both be implicated. You for fraud, me for collecting under false pretenses, even though I genuinely believed you were dead. The scandal would destroy what's left of our name in this town, and Violet... He looked at his sleeping daughter. It would ruin her. Marguerite felt the trap closing around them, felt the consequences of her desperate choice 18 months ago finally catching up. She thought she could slip back into their lives quietly, help Violet heal and disappear again. But she'd underestimated the complexity of love and damage, the way grief had changed Nicholas into someone capable of growth, the way her daughter's need had changed her back into someone who couldn't run anymore. So what do we do? She asked quietly. Nicholas stood slowly, moved to the window, stared out at the rain-soaked grounds. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. For tonight, nothing. Violet needs sleep, and we both need time to think. Tomorrow we'll talk about what's possible, but Marguerite, he turned to face her, you owe me the truth, all of it. Not just why you left, but why you came back as a stranger. Why you thought you could deceive me. I didn't think I could, she admitted. I thought I could stay just long enough to help Violet, then leave before you saw through Eleanor Ashford. But I forgot how well you know me, how you've always been able to see through my defenses when you chose to look. Something flickered in his expression, pain maybe, or recognition. I was blind to what mattered. I saw what I wanted you to be instead of who you were. But I'm not that man anymore, Marguerite. Losing you changed me. Or maybe, he added bitterly, thinking I'd lost you changed me. I don't know if that counts now that it turns out you chose to leave. It counts, she said softly. Change counts no matter what causes it. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once and left the nursery. Marguerite sat in the rocking chair with Violet in her arms, listening to the house settle around them, and tried to imagine a future that didn't end in disaster. Because the truth was more complicated than she'd admitted. She'd come back not just for Violet, but because some part of her had never stopped loving Nicholas, had never stopped hoping he might become the man he'd promised to be when they first met in Paris. She'd come back because home, however imperfect, however dangerous, was still home. And now she had to figure out how to build a life here without destroying everything in the process. The next morning arrived grey and cold, with frost on the windows and tension thick enough to cut. Marguerite had moved Violet to her own bed around midnight, then spent the remaining hours alternating between pacing her small room and staring at the ceiling, trying to plan. By the time dawn broke, she concluded there was no good plan, only choices with different degrees of danger. She dressed carefully in Eleanor Ashford's modest grey dress, pinned her hair in Eleanor's simple style, and went downstairs to find Nicholas already in the breakfast room. He looked as sleepless as she felt, with dark circles under his eyes, and his jaw set in that stubborn way she remembered from their worst fights. Mrs. Dawson was absent. Saturday morning she walked to town for the market, which meant they were alone. "How is she?" Nicholas asked without preamble. "Still sleeping. The emotional release last night exhausted her." Marguerite poured coffee with steady hands, though her pulse was hammering. "We need to discuss what to tell her. She recognized me, but she's confused. She doesn't understand why her mother came back as someone else." "Neither do I, frankly." Nicholas pushed his untouched breakfast aside. "You had 18 months to reveal yourself. You could have written a letter, could have contacted me through a lawyer, could have done this 1,000 ways that didn't involve deception." "Would you have let me see her?" Marguerite challenged. "If I'd written from New York saying I'd faked my death but wanted to be part of Violet's life, would you have welcomed me back? Or would you have called the police and had me charged with fraud and abandonment?" The question hung between them. They both knew the answer. The old Nicholas, the controlling one, would have used the law as a weapon. But this Nicholas, the one transformed by grief, hesitated. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I'd like to think I would have chosen what was best for Violet, but 18 months ago, right after the fire, when I was drowning in guilt, I probably would have lashed out. Would have tried to hurt you the way you'd hurt me." It was the most honest answer he could have given. Marguerite felt some of her defensive anger soften. "I did hurt you. I know that. And I'm sorry. But Nicholas, you have to understand. I was 26 years old, and I felt like I was suffocating. Every conversation with the town ladies who looked down on me, every time you corrected how I dressed or spoke, every argument about whether Violet should learn French or take piano or have friends who weren't from appropriate families, it added up, until I felt like I was disappearing." "So you made yourself disappear." He said it flatly, but there was something else in his voice now. Not quite forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of understanding. "I thought it was my only choice. The fire was an accident. A lamp tipped over, I think, though I never found out for certain. But when I realized the east wing was burning and I could escape through the servants' passage, it felt like fate offering me a way out." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "I walked to the train station in Pittsfield, spent the night in a motel, and the next morning I read in the papers that Countess Hartley had perished, that her husband had tried to save her, that the town was gathering for a memorial. And you let us all believe it," Nicholas said. "You let your daughter grow up thinking her mother was dead. Violet was 4 when I left. She barely knew me as anything but the woman her father was always fighting with. Marguerite knew this was weak, knew it didn't justify anything, but she needed him to see her reasoning. I told myself, she'd be better off with you, that you'd remarry someone appropriate, and she'd have a stable life. I didn't expect her to stop speaking. I didn't expect you to fall apart. How did you know we had? You said you watched from a distance. What does that mean?" Marguerite took a breath. This was the part she'd dreaded. "I stayed in New York for 6 months, worked under an assumed name, saved money, but I couldn't stop thinking about Violet. So I started making trips back, staying in Lenox or Great Barrington, walking past Blackwood, watching from the woods. I saw the house fall into disrepair, Saw you leaving for Boston every week looking haunted. Saw the governesses come and go. And one day I saw Violet in the garden with Mrs. Dawson, and she just stood there silent and still as a ghost, and I realized what I'd done. I'd thought I was freeing myself, but I'd broken my daughter. Her voice cracked on the last words. Nicholas reached across the table, an instinctive gesture he seemed to regret immediately, and almost touched her hand before pulling back. "She needs you," he said quietly. "Whatever else is true, Violet needs her mother. Last night when you held her, when she spoke for the first time in a year and a half, that was real. That mattered." "So what do we tell her? What do we tell Mrs. Dawson, the town, everyone?" Nicholas stood, began pacing the length of the breakfast room. She'd seen him do this 1,000 times when working through legal problems. His mind organized itself through movement. Finally, he turned to face her. "Here's what I think. We tell Violet the truth, or as much of it as a 7-year-old can understand. That you were sick, that you went away to get better, that you missed her so much you came back, but were afraid she wouldn't remember you. We tell her Eleanor Ashford was a name you used because you weren't ready to be Marguerite again. But we make it clear, to her and to ourselves, that you're staying, that this isn't temporary." "I can't legally stay," Marguerite protested. "I'm dead. I have no identity. If anyone finds out, that's why we don't let anyone find out." He spoke with the careful logic of a lawyer constructing a case. "Eleanor Ashford stays on as governess. She becomes indispensable to this household. And gradually, very gradually, over months or years, if we choose to, we might reveal the truth. But not now. Not while Violet is fragile and you're vulnerable and I'm—" He paused, still figuring out how I feel about any of this. It was a plan, Marguerite realized. Not a good one, not without risks, but better than the alternatives. She would remain Eleanor Ashford publicly, while being Marguerite to her daughter in private. She would live in the house with the man she'd once loved and left, would share meals and conversations and the daily work of raising their child, all while maintaining a fiction for the outside world. "There's one more thing," Nicholas said, and his voice had gone careful again. "We need to establish boundaries. You're not my wife anymore, Marguerite. That marriage died with you. Whatever this is, this co-parenting arrangement, this deception we're agreeing to, it can't be confused with what we had before." The words stung, though she'd expected them. "I understand." "Do you? Because I spent 18 months learning to live without you. Learning that the love I felt was tangled up with possession, with the need to control. I've been working with a therapist in Boston, trying to understand why I couldn't just let you be yourself. And I've made progress. I was becoming someone better. But now you're back, and all I want is—" He stopped himself. "It doesn't matter what I want. What matters is Violet. What do you want?" Marguerite asked quietly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the war happening behind his eyes. Desire and anger, grief and relief, love and betrayal, all fighting for dominance. "I want to understand how you could leave us. I want to forgive you, but I don't know if I can. I want to touch you, to prove you're real. But I'm afraid if I do, I'll either pull you close or push you away, and I don't know which would be worse." His honesty was brutal. "I want my wife back, but my wife is dead. You're someone else now. We both are." "Then maybe," Marguerite said carefully, "we build something new. Not a marriage, not yet, maybe not ever. But a partnership, for Violet's sake, and maybe for our own." Nicholas considered this, then nodded slowly. "A partnership, with boundaries and honesty and no illusions about happy endings." "No illusions," she agreed. They sealed the agreement with nothing more than a long look, and in that moment Marguerite felt the shift between between them, from husband and wife to something uncharted, something that would have to be built carefully from the ruins of what they'd been. Upstairs, Violet was waking. They heard her small footsteps on the floor above, heard her calling out, "Maman," in a voice still rough from disuse. "Together?" Nicholas asked. "Together," Marguerite confirmed. They climbed the stairs side by side, and when they entered the nursery, Violet was standing by the window in her nightgown, her dark hair wild around her shoulders, her eyes wide and uncertain. She looked from her father to Eleanor, to Marguerite, and back again. "Papa," she said, her voice barely audible. "Is Maman really here? I didn't dream her." Nicholas knelt down, opened his arms, and Violet ran to him. He held her close, and Marguerite saw tears on his cheeks as he spoke. "She's here, sweetheart. Your mother is here. She was sick and went away for a while, but she's come back because she missed you so much. But Mrs. Dawson said she died in the fire." Violet's voice was gaining strength with each word, as if speaking was a muscle that needed to be exercised after long disuse. "There was a funeral. Everyone wore black." Marguerite moved closer, knelt beside them both. "I know this is confusing, ma petite, but sometimes grown-ups make mistakes because they're scared or sad. I made a big mistake when I left. I thought you'd be better without me, but I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Violet studied her with those serious grey eyes. "Why did you pretend to be Eleanor?" "Because I wasn't sure if you'd remember me," Marguerite said, which was partly true. "I thought maybe if I came back as someone new, I could help you without making you sad about losing your maman. But then you recognized my song, and I realized you never forgot me at all." "I never forgot," Violet confirmed solemnly. "I just couldn't talk about you because it hurt too much, but I still remembered. I remembered the lullaby and the way you smelled like roses and how you used to let me help you paint." "We'll paint again," Marguerite promised, "if your papa says it's all right." Nicholas nodded, his arms still around Violet. "We'll do lots of things differently now, but Violet, you have to understand. Other people still think your mother died in the fire, so when Mrs. Dawson comes back, when we go to town, Miss Ashford has to be the governess. At home, when it's just us, she can be Maman. Can you do that?" Violet frowned, processing this complex instruction. "It's like a game, like pretend." "Exactly like that," Nicholas said. "The most important game we've ever played." "What if I make a mistake? What if I call her Maman in front of people?" "Then we'll say you miss your mother very much, and sometimes you call the people who take care of you by that name," Marguerite said. "Lots of children do that with teachers or nannies." Violet seemed to accept this logic. She pulled away from Nicholas and climbed into Marguerite's lap, wrapped her thin arms around her neck and whispered fiercely, "I'm glad you're not dead, Maman, even if we have to play pretend." "So am I, mon cœur." Marguerite whispered back, "So am I." The three of them stayed like that until they heard Mrs. Dawson's key in the front door, heard her footsteps in the hall below. Then they pulled apart, resumed their roles. Nicholas, the distant father, Eleanor, the capable governess, Violet, the slowly recovering child, and began the complicated dance that would define their lives for whatever time they could sustain this fragile reconstruction of family. That Sunday afternoon, while Violet napped and Mrs. Dawson attended services in town, Nicholas took Marguerite to the sealed east wing. The door had been padlocked since the fire, the rooms beyond left as they were the night she'd disappeared. He unlocked it with a key he wore on a chain around his neck. She noticed he kept it close to his heart, and pushed open the door to reveal a corridor blackened by smoke, wallpaper curling away from walls, the acrid smell of burned wood and fabric still clinging to everything. "I couldn't bring myself to repair it," he said, leading her down the hall. "It felt like destroying evidence. Like if I cleaned it up, I'd be erasing what happened, erasing you." They reached what had been her bedroom, and Marguerite stopped in the doorway. The four-poster bed was a skeleton of charred wood. The windows were broken, the walls were scorched black. But in the corner, miraculously untouched, stood her small writing desk with her journal still sitting on top of it, leather cover warped by heat, but intact. "I didn't know that survived," she breathed. "I found it 3 weeks after the fire," Nicholas said. "I've read it 1,000 times, trying to understand, trying to see what I missed." Marguerite felt her stomach drop. Her journal, the place where she poured out all her frustrations, her suffocation, her plans to leave, the proof of premeditation. "And what did you learn?" "That I was destroying you," he said simply. "Page after page of you trying to be what I wanted, failing, feeling yourself disappear. The last entry," his voice roughened, "the last entry was the day of the fire. You wrote, 'I cannot do this anymore. Tomorrow I will tell him I need space, time, something. If he refuses, I don't know what I'll do.'" "I did tell you," Marguerite remembered, "that night at dinner. I said I needed to visit my friend in New York, that I was suffocating, that I needed time to think, and you said, 'I said you were being melodramatic,'" Nicholas finished. "I said your place was here, with Violet and me. I said real women didn't run away from their responsibilities." He picked up the journal, handed it to her. "I was wrong, about all of it." Marguerite took the journal, felt the weight of her old life in her hands. She flipped through pages of elegant French script, her own words confronting her. Desperate, sad, sometimes angry. Always searching for a way out that didn't involve hurting the people she loved. "There's something else," Nicholas said. He moved to the wardrobe, still standing despite fire damage, and pulled open the door. Inside, protected by the heavy wood, hung some of her dresses. Her everyday clothes had burned, but her formal gowns, the ones she rarely wore, had survived. He reached to the back and withdrew a small wooden box. "I found this hidden behind the dresses. I assume you plan to take it with you?" Marguerite recognized the box. She'd forgotten it in her panicked flight. Inside were her mother's pearls, some cash she'd been secretly saving, and, her heart sank, her passport. Her real passport, with her real name. Marguerite Anne Beaumont, born Lyon, France, 1933. "I could have gone to the police with this," Nicholas said, watching her face. "Could have proven you'd planned to disappear, that the fire was your cover. But I didn't. Want to know why?" "Why?" "Because the woman who wrote in that journal, who hid this box, who was so desperate she risked death to escape, that woman deserved to be free, even if it destroyed me." He closed the box, handed it to her. "Keep it. You might need it someday." Marguerite looked at him, at this man she'd left behind, and felt her careful walls crumbling. "Nicholas, Don't," he interrupted. "Don't say you love me or you're sorry or any of the things we're both thinking. Not yet. We need time. We need to figure out if what we feel now is real or just the ghost of what we used to feel. But Marguerite..." He turned to face her fully. "I'm glad you came back. For Violet, yes, but also for myself. Because maybe this is our chance to do it right this time. To build something that doesn't suffocate either of us. And if we can't," she asked quietly, "if we try and fail, then we fail as partners, as co-parents, not as the people we used to be. We fail forward instead of backward." He smiled slightly, the first real smile she'd seen from him since returning. "My therapist would be proud of that phrase." "You're really seeing a therapist?" It surprised her. The old Nicholas would have seen therapy as weakness. "Every week in Boston, Dr. Chen. She's helping me understand why I tried to control you, why I couldn't separate love from possession." He gestured around the burned room. "This is where it got me. A dead wife, a broken daughter, and a house falling apart because I couldn't face what I'd done. So yes, I'm seeing a therapist, because I don't want to be that man anymore." They stood together in the ruins of her old bedroom, in the physical evidence of the night. Everything had burned down. Her old life, his illusions, the marriage that had been built on passion but poisoned by control. And Marguerite felt, for the first time since returning to Blackwood, that maybe reconstruction was possible. Maybe they could build something new from these ashes. "What do we do with this room?" she asked. "What do you want to do with it?" She looked around, at the charred bed, the broken windows, the journal in her hands. "I think we repair it. Not erase it, but transform it. Make it into something useful. Maybe a proper schoolroom for Violet, with good light and bookshelves and a piano." Nicholas nodded slowly. "A schoolroom, I like that. Something for her future instead of our past." "Together?" Marguerite asked, echoing his earlier question. "Together," he confirmed. They left the east wing and locked it behind them, but Marguerite kept the journal and the wooden box. That night, after Violet was asleep and Mrs. Dawson had retired to her cottage on the property, Marguerite sat at the small desk in her bedroom and opened the journal to a new page. She'd stopped writing when she became Eleanor Ashford. It felt too dangerous to leave evidence, but now, in the privacy of her locked room, she began again. October 26th, 1962. "I am Marguerite Beaumont Hartley. I am Eleanor Ashford. I am both and neither. I am a mother who abandoned her child and came back. I am a wife who faked her death and returned to the man she fled. I am a woman who chose survival over responsibility and is now trying to choose both." Nicholas says we need time. He's right, but I can already feel the old pull, the attraction that brought us together in Paris, complicated now by everything we've learned through loss. He's different, softer, more self-aware, willing to examine his own failures. I'm different too. Stronger maybe, or just more honest about my limitations. Violet spoke today, really spoke, not just single words but full sentences, questions, observations. 7 years old and already so serious, so careful with her words, as if she's learned they have weight. She asked me tonight if I would leave again, and I told her the truth, that I made a terrible mistake before, that I hurt people I loved, but that I'm staying now. That I choose this, even knowing how hard it will be. The question is whether choosing this is enough, whether love and good intentions can overcome fraud and betrayal and 18 months of lies. Whether we can sustain this impossible balance, public fiction and private truth, governess and mother, strangers rebuilding into something that might eventually resemble family. I don't know the answer, but for the first time in years, I'm willing to stay and find out. She closed the journal and hid it in the back of her drawer, beneath Eleanor Ashford's sensible stockings and plain underthings. Tomorrow they would start again. Lessons with Violet, careful conversations with Nicholas, the daily performance for Mrs. Dawson and anyone else who might visit. They would be patient and strategic and hope that time would either heal them or clarify whether healing was even possible. But tonight, Marguerite allowed herself to hope. And in the room down the hall, she knew Nicholas was doing the same, both of them lying awake in the dark house, listening to their daughter breathe in sleep, and wondering if resurrection was possible for marriages, as well as people who'd been presumed dead. The question would take months to answer, would require them both to be braver and more honest than they'd ever been before. But the fact that they were asking it at all, that felt like progress. That felt tentatively like the beginning of something real. Would you like me to continue with the remaining parts of the story, exploring how Nicholas and Marguerite navigate this complex situation while maintaining their secret, developing their relationship, and eventually reaching their earned happy ending? The first month of their arrangement unfolded with careful precision, like a choreographed dance where one misstep could expose everything. Marguerite settled into the rhythm of being Eleanor Ashford by day, proper, reserved, addressing Nicholas as Mr. Hartley in front of Mrs. Dawson, keeping appropriate distance. But behind closed doors, when it was just the three of them, she was maman again, reading to Violet in French, teaching her to paint watercolors of the autumn landscape, singing the old lullabies that made her daughter's face light up with recognition and relief. Nicholas maintained his schedule of weekly trips to Boston, but he began returning earlier, staying longer. Marguerite noticed the changes in him, the way he asked Violet questions and actually waited for her answers, the way he'd stopped trying to dictate every aspect of the household routine, the way he looked at Marguerite when he thought she wasn't watching, as if memorizing her all over again. It was Mrs. Dawson who became their first real obstacle. The housekeeper wasn't suspicious exactly, but she was observant, and one evening in early November she cornered Marguerite in the kitchen. "You're good with the child," Mrs. Dawson said, pouring them both tea. "Better than good. It's like you know exactly what she needs before she asks, and she's blooming under your care, speaking full sentences now, laughing even. Mr. Hartley looks 10 years younger than he did a month ago." "I'm glad to hear it," Marguerite said carefully, keeping Eleanor's measured tone. "The thing is," Mrs. Dawson continued, "I've been with this family for 20 years. I knew the Countess from the day Mr. Hartley brought her home from France. And you remind me of her, Miss Ashford, not just in looks, though there's something about your profile when you turn a certain way, but in manner. The way you tilt your head when Violet speaks, the way you arrange flowers, the way you hum while you work, always French songs." Marguerite felt her pulse spike, but kept her expression neutral. "Perhaps I studied in France. I did spend time abroad during my education." "Perhaps." Mrs. Dawson's eyes were shrewd. "Or perhaps something else is going on that I'm not meant to understand. But I'll tell you this, whatever it is, it's helping that little girl heal. And Mr. Hartley, he's coming back to life. So I'm not asking questions, Miss Ashford. I'm just saying I notice things, and I'm loyal to this family above all else." The implicit message was clear. Mrs. Dawson suspected something, but she wasn't going to interfere as long as Violet and Nicholas were thriving. Marguerite felt a rush of gratitude mixed with anxiety. One ally was good, but it also meant their secret wasn't as airtight as they'd hoped. That night, she told Nicholas about the conversation. They were in his study. Their nightly ritual had become these late-evening meetings where they discussed Violet's progress, the household, and gradually, carefully, their own tangled feelings. "She knows," Nicholas said flatly, "or suspects strongly enough that it amounts to the same thing. Should we tell her the truth?" "I don't know. Maybe." He poured them both wine, another ritual that had developed. "The problem is, the more people who know, the more vulnerable we are. But Mrs. Dawson has been with my family since I was 16. She's discreet, and she's right that Violet is thriving. She is." Marguerite allowed herself a smile. Today she wrote a full paragraph about the garden, in French and English both, and she asked if she could invite the minister's daughter to tea. Apparently they used to be friends before everything. "Before you died," Nicholas supplied. "We can say it, Marguerite. Before I thought I'd killed you through negligence, and you let me believe it." The bitterness in his voice was still there, surfacing in moments when his guard was down. They'd been civil, even warm at times, but they hadn't addressed the deeper wounds. Marguerite had been waiting for him to be ready, but maybe waiting was just another form of avoidance. "You're still angry," she said quietly. "Of course I'm still angry." He set down his glass with more force than necessary. "You let me live in hell for 18 months. You let me believe I destroyed the woman I loved. Do you have any idea what that does to a person? I woke up every morning wishing I'd died in that fire instead of you. I considered—" He stopped, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Marguerite felt ice in her veins. "Nicholas, you didn't—" "No, I didn't. Because of Violet. because someone had to be here for her, and I'd already failed so catastrophically that I couldn't compound it by abandoning her completely. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration she remembered from their marriage. But I thought about it a lot. And then you waltzed back in here pretending to be someone else, and I'm supposed to just... What? Forgive you? Pretend it's all fine now? I never asked you to pretend it's fine, Marguerite said, her own anger rising to meet his. I know what I did was unforgivable, but you act like you had no part in driving me away, like I left a perfect marriage for no reason. I never said our marriage was perfect. I've admitted my failures, my control issues, all of it. I've been in therapy trying to become a better person. What have you done except hide in New York and watch from a distance like some kind of ghost? I've suffered too, Marguerite shot back. I left my daughter. I've had to live with that choice every single day. You think I didn't cry myself to sleep in that awful apartment, wondering if she was okay, if she missed me, if I'd made a terrible mistake? You think I didn't read every newspaper article I could find about the fire, about your grief, about Violet's silence, and feel like I was being torn apart? Then why didn't you come back sooner? Why wait 18 months? Because I was terrified. The words burst out of her. I was terrified you'd have me arrested, terrified Violet would hate me, terrified I'd come back and everything would be exactly the same, that I'd be suffocating again within weeks, and we'd all be trapped in the same miserable cycle. They stared at each other across the study, both breathing hard, years of pain and resentment finally spilling out. Then, unexpectedly, Nicholas laughed. A bitter, exhausted sound. "We're a mess," he said. "Both of us. Completely broken." "Yes," Marguerite agreed, "and we are. So what do we do about it?" She thought about it, about all the therapy language Nicholas had been learning, about the self-help books she'd read in New York, trying to understand her own choices. "I think we stop pretending we're fine, stop being so careful around each other. If you're angry, be angry. If I'm hurt, I'll say so. We try honesty for once." "Radical honesty," Nicholas said. "Dr. Chen talks about that. Being truthful even when it's uncomfortable." "Especially when it's uncomfortable," Marguerite corrected. "Because the comfortable lies are what destroyed us the first time." Nicholas nodded slowly, then moved to sit beside her on the small sofa instead of across from her in his usual chair. It was the closest they'd been since she'd returned, close enough that she could smell his familiar scent, wool and cedar and something uniquely him. "Honest truth," he said. "I'm furious with you. And I'm desperately grateful you're here, and I'm terrified that I'll mess this up again, that I'll slip back into old patterns and drive you away. And underneath all of that, I still..." He stopped, struggled with the words. "I still love you. I never stopped. But I don't know if that's enough." Marguerite felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Honest truth, I love you too. I left because I thought I was dying. But part of me died anyway from leaving. And I'm terrified that even this new version of you, this better version, won't be able to accept the real me. The me who ran away. The me who's flawed and scared and sometimes selfish." "I don't want a perfect wife," Nicholas said. "I want you. All of you, including the parts that are scared and flawed. That's what I couldn't understand before. I thought love meant shaping you into what I needed. But real love means accepting who you are and making space for it, even if who I am hurt you badly. Even then." He reached out tentatively, took her hand. "We can't change what happened, but maybe we can learn from it. Build something stronger because we know how easily it can break." They sat like that, hands clasped, until the clock struck midnight. Then Marguerite stood, pressed a kiss to his forehead, the first deliberate touch she'd initiated since returning, and went to her room. It wasn't time yet for more, but it was progress. The next challenge came from an unexpected source, Violet's school. mid-November, the headmistress of the Stockbridge Academy for Young Ladies sent a letter requesting a meeting. Violet had been enrolled since she was 5, but she'd stopped attending after the fire. Now that she was speaking again, the school wanted her back. "We could refuse," Nicholas said, reading the letter at breakfast. "Home education with you is working beautifully." "But she needs friends," Marguerite countered. "She needs to be around other children, to learn social skills, to have a life outside this house. It's risky. What if she slips, calls you maman in front of someone?" They looked at Violet, who was carefully spreading jam on her toast. "Would you like to go back to school?" Marguerite asked her. "See your old friends?" Violet considered seriously. "Will you be here when I come home?" "Every day," Marguerite promised. "Then yes, but I have to remember the game. You're Miss Ashford at school." "That's right, sweetheart." So Violet returned to school, and for 2 weeks everything seemed fine. She came home with stories about her classmates, with arithmetic homework that Marguerite helped her complete, with invitations to birthday parties and play dates. She was careful with names, never slipping, and Marguerite began to relax. Then Mrs. Pemberton came to call. Mrs. Pemberton was Stockbridge society incarnate. Old family, old money, old opinions. She had been one of the worst gossips about Marguerite during her marriage, constantly criticizing her French manners and unconventional ideas. Now she sat in the Blackwood parlour, drinking tea and studying Eleanor Ashford with undisguised curiosity. "I've heard remarkable things about you, Miss Ashford," she said. "The governess who brought little Violet back to life. Quite the miracle worker." "Violet is a remarkable child," Marguerite said carefully, maintaining Eleanor's reserved manner. "She simply needed patience. Indeed, and I understand you studied abroad. Your accent is quite interesting, almost continental at times." Warning bells rang in Marguerite's mind. "I spent some years in Europe, yes. Where exactly?" "My daughter Charlotte spent time in Paris. Perhaps you know some of the same circles." It was a trap, and not a subtle one. Mrs. Pemberton had known Marguerite, had attended her wedding, had been at the memorial service. If Marguerite claimed too much knowledge of Paris, someone might make connections. "I was mostly in Switzerland," Marguerite lied, "a small finishing school near Geneva. I doubt our paths would have crossed." "How disappointing." Mrs. Pemberton's smile was sharp. "Though I must say there's something familiar about you. Have we met before? Perhaps at some social function in Boston or New York?" "I don't believe so." Marguerite's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "I lived quite quietly before coming to Blackwood." Mrs. Pemberton stayed for another excruciating 20 minutes, probing and watching, before finally leaving. The moment her car disappeared down the drive, Nicholas emerged from his study where he'd been listening. "She suspects," he said grimly, "or she's just being her usual intrusive self. No, I know that woman. She's like a bloodhound when she senses scandal." Nicholas began pacing. "If she starts investigating, starts comparing Eleanor Ashford's background to Marguerite's mannerisms..." "We'll handle it," Marguerite said, more confidently than she felt. "My papers are solid. Eleanor Ashford exists on record. I made sure of that." But that night, lying awake in her small room, Marguerite felt the walls closing in. They'd been so focused on internal healing that they'd forgotten the external threats, the town's gossip network, the people who'd known Marguerite and might recognize something familiar in Eleanor. The simple fact that maintaining a lie was exhausting work that eventually demanded to be exposed. The breaking point came 2 weeks before Christmas. Violet had been invited to participate in the school's holiday pageant, and Marguerite, as her governess, was expected to attend. Nicholas would be there too, along with most of Stockbridge society. It would be the first time Eleanor Ashford appeared publicly in a large social setting, and the risk was enormous. "We could say you're ill," Nicholas suggested, "and disappoint Violet. She's singing a solo, Nicholas. She's so proud." prepare. We make sure your story is airtight. We stop living in fear. Marguerite interrupted. I've been thinking about this, about what we're teaching Violet by hiding, by maintaining this elaborate lie, and I think maybe it's time to tell the truth. Nicholas stared at her. You want to reveal everything? Marguerite, we'd be destroyed. The insurance fraud alone, not reveal everything. But maybe let Eleanor Ashford fade away naturally. Maybe I start appearing as your... She hesitated. As your companion. Someone you've grown close to. Eventually, someone you plan to marry. No one needs to know Eleanor and Marguerite are the same person. Eleanor simply transitions into a new life. And when people notice the resemblance, when they point out that I'm marrying someone who looks remarkably like my dead wife, people will say you have a type, Marguerite said. It's not uncommon. Widowers often seek out partners who remind them of their lost loves. It's romantic even, in a gothic sort of way. Nicholas sat down heavily. It could work. But it would require perfect timing, perfect execution, and it means committing to this, to us, permanently. No more uncertainties. Marguerite moved to kneel in front of him, took both his hands. I'm ready to commit if you are. Not to the marriage we had before, but to something new, something built on honesty and respect and the knowledge that we both nearly destroyed each other once and chose not to again. That's the least romantic proposal I've ever heard, Nicholas said, but he was smiling. I'm French. We're practical about love. He laughed, a real laugh this time, warm and unguarded. Then he pulled her up onto his lap, and for the first time since she'd returned, he kissed her. It was tentative at first, both of them testing boundaries, remembering the shape of each other. Then deeper, more certain, carrying all the grief and relief and complicated love that had brought them back together. When they finally pulled apart, Nicholas rested his forehead against hers. All right. We do this carefully, strategically. After the new year, Eleanor Ashford becomes less formal, more part of the family. By spring, we announce an engagement, summer wedding, quiet, maybe at the courthouse. And meanwhile, we let the East Wing renovation begin, make it obvious we're building a future, not hiding a past. Together, Marguerite said, the word that had become their promise. Together, he confirmed. The Christmas pageant arrived on a snowy December evening. The school assembly hall was packed with parents and grandparents, children in angel costumes, and shepherd's robes running through the halls. Marguerite sat in the third row with Nicholas beside her, both of them scanning the crowd for potential threats. Mrs. Pemberton was there, of course, with her daughter Charlotte and son-in-law. She waved at Nicholas with pointed friendliness, her eyes lingering on Marguerite with that same suspicious curiosity. But there were others too, families who'd known the Hartleys for generations, people who'd attended Marguerite's memorial service, society matrons who trafficked in gossip and scandal. Then the lights dimmed and the program began. Violet appeared in the third act, wearing a white dress with silver wings, her dark hair crowned with a tinsel halo. She looked so much like her mother at that age that Marguerite heard audible gasps from some of the older attendees who remembered the Beaumont family photos Marguerite had once kept on display. When Violet began to sing a French carol, Il est né, le divin enfant, her voice was clear and pure, and Marguerite felt tears streaming down her face. Nicholas found her hand, squeezed it tightly. This was their daughter, alive and thriving, singing in her mother's native language before a crowd that thought that mother was dead. The song ended to enthusiastic applause. Violet beamed, curtsied, and as she scanned the audience for her father, her eyes found Marguerite. For just a moment her expression wavered, the need to run to Maman versus the requirement to maintain the game. Then she smiled, a secret smile just for them, and exited stage left with the other angels. After After the program, there was punch and cookies in the reception hall. Marguerite and Nicholas stood together, accepting compliments on Violet's performance, deflecting questions about Miss Ashford's background with practiced ease. They were doing well until Charlotte Pemberton cornered them. "Miss Ashford," Charlotte said, "I couldn't help but notice you were quite moved by Violet's song. Do you speak French?" "I studied it in school," Marguerite said neutrally. "How lovely. You know, that was one of the Countess's favorite carols. She used to sing it every Christmas. I remember because my mother found it terribly scandalous, mixing Catholic French traditions with our good Protestant celebration." Charlotte's smile was poisonous. "You remind me of her, actually. Something about your bearing. Has anyone ever told you that?" "Charlotte, that's enough," Nicholas said sharply. "I'm merely making an observation, Nicholas. Miss Ashford does bear a striking resemblance to your late wife. The same colouring, the same elegant way of moving. One might think that Mr. Hartley has consistent taste." A new voice interrupted. Mrs. Dawson had appeared at Marguerite's elbow, solid and protective. "And that Providence has been kind enough to send someone who can help his daughter thrive. Unless you're suggesting something improper, Mrs. Pemberton." Charlotte flushed. "Of course not. I was simply gossiping as usual," Mrs. Dawson said calmly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, Miss Ashford needs to collect Violet. She's had a long evening." They escaped to find Violet, who was holding court with her classmates, glowing with pride. On the drive home through falling snow, she chattered about the performance, about her friends' reactions, about how she'd remembered every word even though she was nervous. "You were magnificent," Marguerite told her. "Did I do the game right? I wanted to run to you after, but I remembered. You did perfectly, mon cœur. We're so proud of you." That night, after Violet was asleep, Nicholas and Marguerite sat in the study, reviewing their narrow escape. "Mrs. Dawson defended you," Nicholas observed. "She knows. She has to know." "So we tell her," Marguerite decided. "We bring her into our confidence. She's earned it, and we need an ally." They told Mrs. Dawson the next morning. The housekeeper listened to the whole story: the fire, the escape, the 18 months apart, the return as Eleanor Ashford, without interrupting. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I suspected from the beginning," she finally said, "but I thought I must be going mad. The dead don't come back, not usually. But then I watched you with the child, watched Mr. Hartley come alive again, and I thought, what does it matter if it's impossible, if it's helping them heal? We're planning to transition Eleanor Ashford out gradually," Nicholas explained. "Let her become part of the family in a different capacity, eventually marry under Eleanor's name. And the insurance money? We'll find a way to return it," Nicholas said, "anonymously over time, but we can't draw attention to it now." Mrs. Dawson nodded. "Then I'm with you, whatever you need. That child has her mother back, and that's worth protecting." With Mrs. Dawson as their ally, the household shifted into easier patterns. Marguerite no longer had to hide in plain sight. She could be herself in the house, could drop the careful performance of Eleanor Ashford, could parent Violet openly. They began the renovation of the East Wing, hiring local contractors who transformed the fire-damaged rooms into a bright schoolroom with tall windows, new bookshelves, and the piano Marguerite had promised. Winter deepened into the new year, and true to their plan, Eleanor Ashford became less governess and more family. She took meals with Nicholas instead of in the nursery. She accompanied him to parent meetings at the school. She began, very gradually, appearing at his side in ways that suggested something deeper than an employment relationship. The town noticed, of course. By February, the gossip had reached fever pitch. Was Nicholas Hartley courting his daughter's governess? Was it appropriate so soon after his wife's death? But sympathy was largely on his side. He'd been a devoted husband who'd lost everything in tragedy. If he'd found comfort with a kind woman who loved his child, who could begrudge him that? In March, Nicholas formally proposed not to Marguerite Beaumont Hartley, legally dead, but to Eleanor Ashford, governess and companion. He did it properly, with a new ring. Marguerite's original wedding band was still in that wooden box in her drawer, and a simple question: will you marry me, knowing everything we've been through, and build a life that's honest and real? Yes, she said, and meant it with her whole heart. They married in June at the courthouse in Pittsfield, with only Mrs. Dawson and Violet as witnesses. It was nothing like the elaborate wedding Marguerite and Nicholas had had in Paris. No society reception or orchestra or champagne toasts. Just two people who destroyed each other once and were choosing, consciously and carefully, to try again. Violet served as flower girl, solemn and proud in a yellow dress. When the judge asked if anyone objected to the union, she piped up, "I think it's perfect. Miss Ashford, I mean Eleanor, she makes Papa happy, and she makes me happy too." The judge, charmed, pronounced them married. Nicholas kissed his bride, really Eleanor, really Marguerite, really some synthesis of both, and Violet cheered. They returned to Blackwood as Mr. and Mrs. Hartley, though Marguerite kept Eleanor's name for legal purposes. The town adjusted quickly. Some of the older ladies clucked about the speed of remarriage, but most people were simply relieved that the tragic widower had found happiness again, that little Violet had a mother figure, that Blackwood Estate might return to its former glory. Mrs. Pemberton and her daughter remained suspicious, but without proof, their insinuations were dismissed as bitter gossip. Over time, even they had to accept the new reality. That first summer, as a reconstituted family, was careful and tender. Marguerite and Nicholas learned each other again, this time without the baggage of impossible expectations, this time with the humility that came from knowing how easily love could be destroyed by selfishness and control. They went to therapy together, worked through resentments and fears, established boundaries and communication patterns that allowed both of them to breathe. Violet thrived. She excelled at school, made friends easily, and gradually the haunted look in her eyes faded. She knew the truth, that her mother had left and come back, that her parents' love was complicated and hard-won, and in knowing it she learned early that relationships required work and honesty and forgiveness. On the anniversary of the fire, they held a private ceremony in the new schoolroom that had been built from the ruins. Nicholas lit a candle for the woman Marguerite had been, for the marriage they'd lost, for the suffering they'd all endured. Then he blew it out, and they walked together into the garden where roses were blooming, where Violet was waiting with the picnic she'd prepared, where life was happening in all its messy, imperfect beauty. "Are we happy?" Marguerite asked Nicholas that evening, after Violet had gone to bed, and they sat on the porch watching fireflies. "I think we're becoming happy," he said carefully. "I think we're building something that might last. What I've learned not to assume, not to take anything for granted." "Good," she said, "because the moment you start assuming, I'll call you on it, and you'll call me on it when I start pulling away or hiding things." "Deal," he said, and kissed her. A promise and a practice, something they were both still learning. Years later, when Violet was grown and married with children of her own, she would tell the story to her own daughter. Not the sanitized version the town believed, that grandmother Eleanor had been a governess who married grandfather Nicholas after his first wife died tragically, but the real version, that sometimes people broke so badly they had to pretend to die to survive, and sometimes love meant letting someone go completely so they could choose to come back freely, and sometimes families were built not on fairy tale perfection, but on hard choices and harder forgiveness, and the daily decision to keep choosing each other despite everything. "So they lived happily ever after?" her daughter asked. "No," Violet said. "They lived honestly ever after. We which is better, harder, and more real. They fought sometimes. They disappointed each other, but they never lied again, never tried to control each other, never forgot that love is a practice, not a possession, and that's the truest happy ending I know. In the master bedroom of Blackwood Estate, now fully restored and filled with light, Marguerite Beaumont Eleanor Hartley, all her names, all herselves, slept beside the man who'd learned to love her without caging her. Downstairs, in a frame on the mantel, was a photograph from Violet's wedding. 3 generations of strong women, and the men who'd learned to stand beside them rather than in front of them. The house no longer smelled of smoke and grief. The east wing was full of Violet's children's laughter when they visited. The garden bloomed year after year, tended by Marguerite's careful hands. And sometimes on quiet evenings she would sing that French lullaby, Fais dodo, colla mon petit frère, and remember the night it had shattered her disguise and rebuilt her family, one honest word at a time. They had earned this peace. They had earned each other, and that was enough. That was everything. That